Okay. Hello, my name is Chris Butcher. I am a master's graduate student at Eastern Michigan University. This is the second part of my thesis, where the first part was about supply chains in the pandemic, and that led me to this part as the policies of the pandemic. So I'll just jump right into it. So this presentation is a condensed elevator pitch of my research. I'm going to go through this data pretty fast. So a rift is formed, a split from the precedents in the recording, aggregating, and reporting of pandemic data. There are at least two distinct data sets that are difficult to compare to each other, that of pre and post March 24th, 2020. This disparate treatment and the data dissemination can be linked to most of the harm caused during the pandemic. The emphasis of this presentation is to show the movement away from the benchmark best practice standard operating procedures like tracking, following, and treating clinical signs and symptoms, which are the infections, and towards vaguely defined cases and bottlenecked testing protocols. So in all past epidemics, pandemics, and endemics, these two forms of pathogenic measure, which is cases and infections, shared a one-to-one relationship. So what changed? So here we have our graph. It's August to August. CDC goes by seasons. So it's centered on the flu season. So, and we have years 2014 to 2020. And what you could see is that for the first year and a half of the pandemic, the deaths were tracking normally. That means they were following the pattern of deaths from previous years in 2019 and 2020. So the virus didn't cause any significant unexpected deaths for the first year and a half of the pandemic. Then all of a sudden, March 24th, around that time frame, 2020, the numbers boosted. So what boosted these numbers? And so we could see that it wasn't the variants, because the virus didn't change yet. The variants aren't even on the graph. Those are over here in September and December, alpha. That's when the variants kicked in. So the virus didn't change. So what changed around this time frame where you see an obvious boost in the deaths? So the policies, we implemented a lot of policies at this point. And looking back now, the data shows one significant impact of the policies is a spike in the elderly and immunocompromised deaths after March 24th. So yeah, with the viral infection of SARS-CoV-2 as the sub-event. So the policies are what's driving the harm is my hypothesis. So we now know that the impact of these policies is to uncouple the usual driving forces of pathogen spread, such as infection and clinical signs and symptoms, and instead artificially insert the RT-PCR, which is reverse transcript polymerase chain reaction test, as the driving force behind the pandemic. So that led me to my research question, how are these policies impacting how we record, how we gather up, how we aggregate, and how we report our data? And this is Shijin Lin. She is the most important virologist in the pandemic. My working measure is, if you don't know who Shijin Lin is and you don't recognize her, your working knowledge about the pandemic is basically a 1 out of 10. She is wearing the only effective PPE against RNA viruses. This is Shijin Lin. So what we're going to do is get rid of the corporate media hysteria, and we're going to get rid of social media fear porn, and we're just going to focus solely on the data. So what we see, we have in the center column, we have the population data over the past couple of years. And what becomes blatantly obvious is that there was no event that decimated the population of the US in the last couple of years. To go one step further, there was no significant event that decreased the population of the US. So based on the data, since 2018, no event transpired that was significant enough to slow the growth of the US population. So the US population increased at a normal rate, and it's an expected rate. So in other words, there was no viral pandemic. There was a new virus, but not an extremely dead one, or not deadly one. And you can see for the third year of the pandemic, 2020, so a year and a half, now all of a sudden the numbers jump. And that's directly related to the policies. I believe I'm prepared to prove that. So where are all these COVID deaths coming from? We have a lot of deaths. It's all over the news. Well, I coined a term called classification capture. So what the policies did is erase the line between being hospitalized or dying with COVID or because of COVID. So now suicides, overdoses, and murders are all COVID deaths after March 24th, 2020. I actually saw this firsthand because my job is a mortuary transporter. So I go to the crime scenes, pick up the body, take it to the mortuary. We had a suicide. It was a self-inflicted shotgun blast to the face. They swabbed the test, or they swabbed the decedent because that's their policy, came back COVID positive. That suicide is now a COVID case. So I know the firsthand the classification capture is happening. That's just anecdotal, but this radically and incorrectly boosted the COVID cases and the number of deaths. So the policies directly impacted how we record deaths now. We are less accurate. So we have all the different diseases, the way people are dying through disease are going down and COVID's going up. They're almost the exact same number after March 24th. Again, second week, third week in April, same thing. Next week, same thing. COVID is capturing all these other deaths, causes of deaths. So what would be the incentive of this? Because it's making, if we wanted to go back and research, this is making all our data less accurate because now it's all just COVID deaths. So what would be an incentive for this? Well, the government incentivized with money. So in places like states like Minnesota, Nebraska, and Montana, they're getting $300,000 per case, not per infection now. Since this is after March 24th, we're moving away from signs and symptoms, which I'll show that the WHO defined a case without signs and symptoms, just a positive test. So now we're getting $300,000 per case. And so you see just this one room in this one hospital in this one state at this one moment, this is $5 million. And this was back in 2020. So we didn't have the vaccines and we didn't really have too many treatments. Ventilators were on their way. So what they do is they get you COVID positive. They get the test back positive, get the $300,000. Then they send you on your way if you could breathe on your own. Next person, please. So this is a huge transfer of wealth. And you can see that New York, they're only getting $12,000 a case. So according to the government, people that live in high population dense areas aren't worth as much as people that live in rural areas. That is a case study in itself, I believe. So since New York is not making enough per person, they implemented some policies that ultimately made up for that in quantity. So what they did is they took normally or otherwise healthy young individuals that are COVID positive now, these young individuals who have a 99.998% survivability rate, they mandated that they start cohabitating with the elderly and the immunocompromised. So we put the young people that are almost guaranteed to survive in with our most vulnerable populations. And usually in pandemics, we try to protect our elderly, protect the immunocompromised. New York did the opposite this time, and other states did too. Whitmer in Michigan is going through litigation for this exact thing right now. So that's New York's answer to that, and that was implemented on March 25th, 2020. So the WHO started the ball rolling on March 20th. They said, we know what the precedent is. We know how we did medicine for the last couple hundred years where we follow the infections. That's how we know where the disease is. But don't do that. We're going to do something different now. We're just going to do a laboratory confirmation, which is a positive test. So they're not going to look who's sick. We're going to look at who tests positive. So this is a huge break. This is how we get the transfer of wealth, because we're not treating sick people anymore. We're treating laboratory confirmed test positive people. So what is this test? Like, this is we're basing the whole future of humanity on this test. So it has to be a good one, which it is good for what it's meant for, but we're not using it for what it's meant for. So I wrote a whole paper on this, but really simply what we need right now is just to know that there's a parameter called the threshold cycle. And that's a thing, a dial you could change to show how many cycles go. And if you want the percentage of your specimens to become more positive, you boost that cycle threshold up to 40 or above. If you want more of the test to come back negative and reflect the actual infection rate, you bring it down. Most of the scientists I interviewed, they said around 15 or so is what they're comfortable with. We're at 40, 45. So we're boosting the number of cases, and they don't reflect the number of infections. So, but since the WHO came in and said we don't need, we don't need signs and symptoms, we just need this positive test. That's when we start getting into this asymptomatic theory. So now they're pushing asymptomatic, and the CSTE, which is the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists, they jump in and put their new standardized case definition to include asymptomatic infections as well. And so the WHO is pushing asymptomatic to where you're not sick, you're healthy, you're doing push-ups, you're eating your smoothies, but you test positive, well, you're asymptomatic. So what they need is some scientific studies behind them. But what they can't do that because the people that did the science, it shows that there's no asymptomatic spread. So what they did was scientism, which they say they got JAMA to do a report that says, no, please don't peer review us. Trust our science. We don't need you to double check us. We got this. What they did was a couple math equations, and they came up with 60% of people are now asymptomatic spreaders. So all the healthy people that are lifting weights and doing good and feeling the best they have in their life, they're the ones making people sick. But in China, they did a test and got it published in Nature, a very, very prestigious journal. They said, yes, please review us because we want to know if we did right. And if we did do wrong, find out where we did wrong. That's scientific method. So they enrolled 10 million participants where JAMA said, please, nobody, we don't need anybody. We're going to do some calculations. So they did Nature did a bunch of tests, and they came back with 0% transmitters. If you're sick and you're sneezing, then you have it. If you come back with a positive test, then you might not have it if you're not sick. So this asymptomatic thing is pretty much dead in the water. So that's pretty much what I'm going to leave off. I went a little too fast, but it's just don't trust the science. Don't take my word for it. Always doubt and verify. Always think critically. So that's where it leads us. Is my hypothesis is changing things changes things. We're changing definitions, like the vaccines, these gene therapies that Pfizer and everybody came out with weren't actually vaccines. So instead of making a new product, CDC changed their definition of vaccine to fit this product. So we're breaking with tradition and we're changing things, and it's having a huge impact on our data and on human life. So that's where I'm gonna stop.
Okay, well, you got it in 15 minutes, and I thought that was going to be impossible.